From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We are joined, as always, with our super producer, Paul, Mission Control Decant. Most importantly, you are here, and that makes this the stuff they don't want you to know. History. That's part of where we're going today, folks. Despite what some of us may experience in grade school, history is much more than a collection of isolated statistics and out-of-context facts printed in dusty classroom tomes. History is both powerful and at times controversial. The story of human civilization in particular is full to the brim of stories that people in power sometimes would rather be forgotten, as well as stories that can empower us with a new understanding of the present. In today's interview, we're diving into the power of history, and we're diving into the consequences of sometimes bad decisions, as well as the literal cautionary tales it can teach us. And we are not setting off on this journey alone. Please join us in welcoming the economist, journalist, broadcaster, and author Tim Harford, the creator of the Cautionary Tales podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today, Tim.
Oh, wow. I'm so pleased to be on the show. Thank you, Ben.
So you can add a podcaster to that too, right? You're an old school and a new school media specialist there, right?
Yeah, I've done it all. I'm feeling my age now, but done it all.
Just on that note, I have to bring this up, Tim. I was looking back just through your work, and I realized I've been watching you on television for quite a while. I think we all have. Specifically, I looked back at an episode of the Colbert Report. There's actually, I'm sure there's more than one. Maybe the only one that I saw and vividly remembered was when you were discussing a book that had recently come out, The Logic of Life. And my goodness, that was wonderful. Thank you for doing that.
There was an incredible experience. Colbert, there was a joke in that exchange about, maybe I shouldn't, I don't know how adult the audience is, so maybe I shouldn't go into all the details of the joke. It was a slightly X-rated joke about Pepsi and Coke.
Yes.
And I had worked on that book for 2 years, and Colbert, and did not, the joke, which in retrospect is obvious, about today's teenagers being the Pepsi generation and what they like to get up to. The joke did not occur to me. It occurred to Stephen in about 3 seconds. I mean, he's very, very good at what he does. He's super nice backstage. He was so nice. He came into the green room and he talked it all through. And he's like, have you ever seen the show? Do you know what the show's about? And I'm going to be in character. My character's a total idiot. My character hasn't read your book. My character doesn't understand anything. And I was like, oh, that's so kind of him. And then he got into character later, and he walked past my dressing room and he yells out, I'm going to tear you apart, Harford. I was like, wow, like the guy is in the zone now. This is how it all works behind the scenes.
Yeah, you got to wonder if that took a toll on him eventually, and that's why he kind of decided to pivot away from doing that character, which it was a wonderful period in his career, but I'm kind of glad that he's just himself now. He's such a thoughtful guy and a devoutly religious man, which is interesting considering the types of conversations that we're having today as well.
And a Dungeons and Dragons fan as well.
That's right. And
which
Tolkien buff.
I mean, he's one of the gang there. There's a Cautionary Tales about Dungeons and Dragons, which we can discuss if you like.
Yes, but the whole reason I'm bringing that up is because that appearance was in 2008, and far before that, and up until that point, and up until today, one of your main, at least in my mind, one of your main studies is in logic itself and how we think and critical thinking and the way we look at things and how we analyze them. And I just want to say thank you for doing that, first of all, because we need it very, very much now and then and before and always. We need that. And how has that pursuit of logic and how has that affected your own work in choosing what to cover next?
It's a good question. It's taken me on quite a journey because I studied philosophy and I studied formal logic and I studied economics. And as a journalist, at first I was covering economics and ideas in economics and the freakonomics kind of stuff, and also statistics and the way people think about numbers and the way numbers are used as weapons and the way numbers are used to sell things, to sell political ideas, to sell you soft drinks, whatever it is. And over time, I came to realize that the way that we process these apparent facts is not often logical. It's emotional. And it's not because people are dumb, it's because they're human. And I got more and more interested in the things that we get wrong, in the way that we persuade ourselves of things that aren't necessarily true. And so I had this journey on studying logic, studying rationality, studying statistical reasoning, to studying the kind of meat sacks that we are, trying to understand all of these things. And I think you need a bit of both. If you're going to understand the world, you want to understand the rational side, but you need to understand the emotional side as well.
The reason I brought up the Colbert thing and him being devoutly religious, when thinking about logic and this kind of stuff, he's obviously an incredibly intelligent man. There are obviously very intelligent people that are very much like yourself, focused on statistics and logic and all of this kind of thing and rational thought, who are devoutly religious. Is there a place for that in your studies that you found, or is it sort of, do you see it as a form of self-delusion?
Well, I'm not a religious person myself, but I certainly wouldn't see it as self-delusion. I mean, my wife is religious, and I think my wife is a person of extreme taste and good judgment in all things.
Smart man.
So I'm struck by how there's a particular group who say that they're logical and say that they're rational about this issue, and then seem to get really up in everyone's faces about it. And I'm not sure that we need to argue so much about this particular subject. I think it's possible to disagree with someone in a friendly way, to still treat them as human, to still treat them as thoughtful, and to be curious about their views. You don't have to agree with them, but you don't have to just constantly be chipping away at them either.
Yeah, and this is something that I see as a common through line in your work, Tim. I will admit that when I was researching this interview that we're doing today, I had a moment of epiphany similar to what Matt described, where I said, "Oh, it's that Tim. I've been reading. I have his books." And I love this through line of exploring empathy as well as economics. And I was wondering if we could ask some kind of dumb questions on my end about economics.
I was going to say there are no dumb questions, but I should wait until I've heard the questions before I say that, shouldn't I? But yeah, go right ahead.
I'm leaning into your long history as a columnist, fielding questions from the public. And one thing that I wanted to start with is the idea that economics have occasionally been called, the dismal science. What, in your mind, are some of the common misconceptions about economics and statistics in the public?
I mean, that dismal science thing is a good place to start, because the person who accused economics of being the dismal science was a guy called Thomas Carlyle, who was very upset that so many economists were abolitionists. They wanted to get rid of the slave trade. And they felt that if you wanted someone to work, you should agree a contract and pay them a wage to which they agree. And that's what you do if you want someone to work for them. You don't treat them as property. You don't oppress them. And Carlyle was like, "Oh, no, you don't understand, kind of. Humanity is so diverse. There are people who are supposed to be masters, and there are people who are supposed to be enslaved. And economists just don't understand this about the diversity of human beings." He's the guy who called us the dismal science. So guilty as charged. I'm happy to be dismal if I think that basically all humans are fundamentally equal. So that's one thing. And then when people call us the dismal science, they very often don't know where that comes from. Another thing that I think people get wrong is they think that economics is basically the study of money. I think actually economists don't think much about money, and you could accuse them of not thinking enough about money and kind of treating it as though it was this, it's a detail, it doesn't really matter. What we're interested in is in the real flow of goods and services and the decisions that people make every day and how they spend their lives and how they spend their time and how they reason. Maybe we should think a bit more about money. But that's the thing. People think that economics is about money, and actually economics is kind of about everything except money. If that sounds a bit weird, but I think it's defensible.
Well, and the economic argument against slavery wasn't necessarily even taking a political stance. It was more just about logistics and like how things would function better, like as a society, if we, moved towards this model. I think there would be higher quality work. There would be less strife. It would just be a better situation. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I'm not an expert in the history of it, but I know that one of the people who was most prominent was John Stuart Mill, who was both one of the greatest economists to have ever lived and also one of the greatest moral philosophers. So I would be fairly confident that he would be taking both the political moral angle and also the practical angle. He would do both.
I want to follow up with the question on misconceptions in the world of statistics. No, you said something that really tickled me right before we were recording, Tim, where we were talking about, our tech details. And you said, I study how things go wrong. So I'm prepared for this stuff. And when we're talking about misconceptions and how things go wrong, something that I believe everyone in our audience has encountered hinges on statistics, especially when sort of cherry-picked, presented by politicians and pundits, usually to attempt to support their point, right? A quick glance at a kind of lazy, simple, colorful infographic and then move on, right? What can the average person do to understand whether or not a statistic is legitimate?
So I wrote an entire book about this, and I'm going to give you the secret to that book so you don't need to buy it, although I do recommend that you do buy it. It's called The Data Detective. Yes. And yeah, I recommend the book, but then I wouldn't I? But let me try and give you so the three-part approach to making sense of a number that you see. It's the 3 C's: calm, context, curiosity. So the first C is calm. Most of the statistics that we see are drawn to our attention on social media or regular media because they elicit an emotional reaction. They're meant to make you upset, afraid, angry, amused at some other person is being stupid, dumbfounded at the mendacity of politicians or something. It's supposed to elicit an emotional reaction. That's why you're seeing it. So the very first thing is just be calm. Notice, what is my emotional reaction? Is it denial? That can't possibly be true. Is it, oh yes, this just proves I'm right? Let me just go and tell my friend who I was arguing about this with. Just notice that reaction, count to 3, then you move on. So the second thing is context. And that's just to ask some basic facts about the statistic that you're being shown. The most basic of all is, what is the definition? What is the way that this thing is being measured, or what is being measured? So let's say, for example, you're having an argument about immigration. Well, immigration is a subject that people get very excited about. They feel very emotional about on one side or the other. But how is it being measured? Like, are we talking about illegal immigration? Are we talking about people kind of illicitly crossing the border? Are we talking about people with green cards? Are we or are we actually not really talking about immigration at all? We're talking about people of different ethnicities. What is it that we're talking about? So get the context. And that can also mean, is the number going up or down, whatever. Could also, is it a big number? Is it a small number? Can I compare it to something that makes it make sense? So first C was calm, second C was context. And the third really encompasses everything, which is curiosity. So you treat all this information as, hey, I don't know everything about the world. There are gaps in my knowledge. Is this filling a gap? Is this answering a question? If it doesn't answer a question, well, dig deeper. Go another click, ask around, get some more context, and view these statistics as a way of making your ignorance smaller, rather than, which sounds obvious, like, of course, a fact informs you, it fills in a gap in your knowledge, but that's not how we treat facts. We treat facts as weapons. We treat them as, aha, I can use this to win an argument. That's how so much of what we see is processed. So treat it instead in a curious frame of mind, calm, context, curiosity. And now you don't have to buy the Data Detective, but maybe you should.
Yeah, I'm going to, for sure. I wish that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle could have purchased the Data Detective while he was still around. I want to bring this back to the 4th C, which is cautionary tales, that is, and a specific episode that that we listened to in preparation for this interview. It's on a curious case of images of fairies, photographs, specifically plates, and how these photographs taken, I guess the first photograph ever taken by an amateur photographer, and how it fooled Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So could you just tell us a bit of the story, maybe the condensed version, and then we can get into what occurred because of belief in this situation?
I find the story just completely enchanting. And by the way, this is a classic way that we approach cautionary tales. So I tell a story, we have actors, we have music, really put in the work to give people a really immersive storytelling experience. And then we try to draw lessons from the story. Like, what went wrong? What was the mistake? Are we making that same mistake ourselves? In this particular case, the story is of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, one of the most famous men in the world at the time. This is about 100 years ago, going public, publishing a book, publishing these huge cover stories saying, we found these photos of fairies. Fairies are real. Mind blown. And he sort of recognized, well, maybe it could be a hoax, but of course it's not a hoax. And he found all these ways to dismiss the evidence that it was a hoax. And the photos, you can look them up on the internet very easily. They're called the Cottingley Fairies. Cottingley being a suburb of Bradford in the north of England. Very charming, black and white photos. You've got these girls. One of them looks about 9 years old. Another one's a little older. And there are these fairies in the foreground. And they kind of look a little bit like maybe they were cut out of a picture book, which probably they in fact were. And yet Sir Arthur convinced himself that a 9-year-old girl can't fake photos. He really wanted to believe. And there's a couple of different things going on there. One was his own family history. He'd been bereaved several times. He'd lost his son, he'd lost his brother, his wife, and his mother. He was very close to his mother. And he really wanted to believe there's something out there, there's something more than just what we can see and touch ourselves. So he was very open to spiritualist beliefs. He was hungry for that. There was also a history in his family of taking fairies seriously. His father was confined to a mental asylum, and he used to draw pictures of fairies and write, I have known such a creature. So there's this real longing to believe. But the other thing was that Sir Arthur was actually a very good photographer himself. His first ever published work was not The Sign of Four or The Hound of Baskervilles, one of these great Sherlock Holmes stories. It was a piece in the British Journal of Photography. So Sir Arthur knew that photographs could be faked. He just didn't want to believe that these ones were. And what he basically told himself is, I know how hard it is to take a photograph. I know how hard it is to fake a photograph. And I don't think a 9-year-old girl can do it. And that's why he just put his whole reputation on the line, and he made a total fool of himself.
I mean, it's so fascinating, especially since this is a man whose life's work is all about detective work and finding clues and using logic and reason to get to a realistic solution to a puzzle. And he threw all that out the window in favor of belief. I think there's the cautionary tale right there. If this can happen to him, it can happen to any of us.
Yes, if you want to believe it enough, you can find a way to believe. There's another cautionary tale, rather darker, but it's very, very similar, of an art forger who fools the greatest art critic in the world. And it's the same basic story. A guy who he knows more than anybody else about the works of Vermeer. And that's why he wants so badly to believe he's just found a Vermeer. And that one involves Nazis and sex workers and kind of all kinds of weird stuff. So it's a little less family friendly, but it's the same fundamental story. The leading expert uses their own expertise to kind of unravel themselves and to fool themselves.
I love that you can apply something like that to other stories, right? Something that you find in cautionary tales as a listener, a larger story, and then apply it to other things. I want to just go quickly back to kind of the origin of the fairy photograph and how it began, because I believe in the episode that you've got, it's not necessarily a statement, but it was an interview that was given at some point by one of the children, either Francis Griffiths or Elsie Wright. I think it may have been Elsie who gave the interview. And she spoke of why it even occurred in the first place and how this entire huge scenario was generated. One of the most famous men, as you said, in the world writing about it. It all started as an attempt to help a child who was, could you tell us that story? The child was getting in trouble for something or getting chastised for something, and she wanted to help. And that's all it was.
She wanted to help out, yeah. Because one of the things we do in Cautionary Tales is there's often more than one side to the story. So we were trying to ask not only how did Sir Arthur fool himself, but also why did these girls do this and why didn't they own up for, it turns out 65 years. They kept the secret for 65 years. And Frances and Elsie were initially motivated because Frances, who was 9, got into trouble with her mother. She slipped in the stream. She got her clothes wet. Her mother was yelling at her and she said, well, I was playing with the fairies. That's why I slipped. And her mother sent her to her room because not only did she get her clothes wet, but she also told a lie about the fairies. And Elsie, who is her cousin, who lives with her, who's older, she's a teenager, she was outraged. Grown-ups are always making up stupid stuff. They're always telling us these fantastical lies. You can think of your own examples. And why should Frances get into such trouble for doing the same thing? So she said to Frances, don't worry, we'll borrow my father's camera. We're going to go down the beck and we will take photographs of the fairies. And that's what they did. And of course, they were fake. Frances always said she really did see fairies, but she admitted that the photographs were faked. Elsie, I think, never believed in fairies. But she believed in her artistic ability. She believed in her ability as a photographer and as an artist. And so it was partly a matter of pride. Once she had started, she wanted to continue. And things escalated. So her father didn't believe her. Her mother was kind of curious. Her mother mentioned the photographs at this meeting of local spiritualists. Word got out to a very senior spiritualist, a man called Edward Gardner. Edward Gardner told Doyle. Doyle got hold of the photographs. Doyle is, as I mentioned, one of the most famous men in the world. And at each stage, Elsie is thinking, probably should own up, but that would be bad. That would be bad. And it just escalated and escalated and escalated, and it just got too far. In the end, she realized she would just humiliate these men. And so not for the first time, this young woman keeps quiet because she doesn't want to offend the egos of these older men.
This is something that really stands out to me about Cautionary Tales. I don't want to spoil too much, but one thing that really stood out in every episode, and in The Mummy's Curse in particular, is the structure, the way that we explore this story of the Mummy's Curse, right, in depth, and we go through all of the anecdotes and all of the embellishments that accrete to the core legend over time. And then toward the turn of the narrative, we learn about selection bias. So in a very real way, Tim, Cautionary Tales seems to me a masterclass in teaching people how to think. So I'm quite curious to learn, when you first set about making this show, did you start with perhaps a list of concepts you wanted to impart, or was it more, did it start the other way? Did you start with these stories, a mummy's curse, a whistleblower, and then say, what can we find? What is our teachable concept in these stories? I'm just interested there.
Well, thank you, Ben. I mean, that is what we're trying to do. We are trying to ensnare people with the stories, to draw them in, get them fascinated by what's going to happen, how's this going to work out, and then while we've got them, then we suddenly whack them over the head with some social science or something, and really sort of tell people something that hopefully they didn't know or they hadn't thought of in a way that they'll remember, with the music and with the acting and so on. So to answer your question, do I start with the story or do I start with the concept? A bit of both at first. So you'd find a concept, you'd think, oh, it'd be great to find a really nice example of, I don't know, plan continuation bias. A plan continuation bias is like when you have a plan and something goes wrong, makes it a bit more difficult, but you kind of stick to it, and something else goes wrong, and something else goes wrong. And we've all had this where, like, we've got some, we're going to meet some friends or we go to a business meeting or something, and gradually more and more obstacles accumulate and the plan gets ever more complicated and difficult. But because it's happening bit by bit, you never take that step back and go, hang on, this is ridiculous. It's absurd. I need a different plan. So sometimes you have the concept, sometimes you got the story, and you think, well, this is a great story, but what's the psychological concept to illustrate? And often there's more than one, and then you can choose. More recently, we've now done, oh, goodness me, probably getting on for, I'm not sure, maybe 40 cautionary tales. And we're releasing new cautionary tales every 2 weeks now. It's more story-driven now, because I find that gets you a better result. It's easier to research. And once you have that library of psychological concepts, if you have a story of something going wrong, you can figure out why. You can figure out a reason why to discuss. But every now and then I bump into some really, really cute psychological idea and I think, wow, I'm going to wait until the story comes along that I can hang that idea on because it's really nice.
You'd be surprised too how easy it is to just like research the idea and how many stories you will find just by like a simple Google search of some concept or some, psychological, construct or whatever. And then they'll be, the internet is a beautiful place and things like Reddit are wonderful hunting grounds for these kinds of tales.
It really is. And sometimes you'll find them mentioned in an academic article, for example, as an example, and you'll look into it. And one of two things happens. Either you find that actually the story is just an urban myth, it never happened, or they've got all kinds of important details wrong. The other thing that sometimes happens, and that's when it gets really fun, is where you go, oh, wow, you guys totally buried the lead. There's so much to this story. It's so fascinating. I can't believe that you just kind of threw it away in 2 sentences, because I can keep people entertained for 40 minutes with this, because it's just so much detail, so amazing, so many twists.
Yes. And I would urge everyone to listen to, especially, I think the Cottingley Ferry story really is extremely strong, especially when it comes to applying lessons we learn within that episode to other things. I keep thinking about the snowballing lie that's at the heart of that story and how you can apply that to something like an alien abduction story that maybe was told to one person or 2 people for a very specific reason to, get out of one situation or another, as you're saying, like this one tiny thing to escape consequences of whatever action. And then you can't tell the truth because it's become too big. And I just wonder if, I think there's so many concepts within the world of conspiracy theories in particular that we can take that and apply it to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm currently very interested in urban myths and which of them have something really important at the heart of them and which are in fact just completely illusory. So I don't want to do too many spoilers because I'm still researching the story, but I'm looking into the poisoned candy myth. Every Halloween, parents are told, some child will die tonight in America because a stranger has poisoned their candy. That will happen. And that is almost completely false. But it's not quite false. And the exception to that is actually one of the most horrendous things I've ever researched in my life for cautionary tales. But even then, it's not the story that people think it is. And the deeper you go, the more you look at it, the more you realize, oh, people misunderstood when this story hit about this was a child who died. When this story hit the headlines, everybody thought they knew what they were looking at, and actually wait a week and the truth comes out. But in a week's time, no one's paying any attention. And it's surprising. That's very similar actually to the Dungeons and Dragons cautionary tales. The story that everyone told and everyone told and everyone told, it turns out there's absolutely nothing to do with what really happened at all. But people remember the fake story and they don't sit around for the reality because the reality is never as fun.
Let's pause here for a word from our sponsor, and we'll return with more from Tim Harford.
And we're back with Tim Harford.
Let's turn the page here to the idea of conspiracies, conspiracy theory, the idea of that grain of truth and that sort of cumulative pearl of BS and malarkey that people love. We love it so much, right? It's cognitive umami. I want to spend some time exploring an article you wrote for The Atlantic in 2021, What Conspiracy Theorists Don't Believe. And I was profoundly into this and realized that we were all very much on the same page when I saw this examination, this very empathetic examination of how we can talk our loved ones back from that cognitive brink. In there, Tim, you draw a distinction that a lot of people don't think about as often as they perhaps should, a distinction between excessive doubt and excessive belief. Could you tell us a little more about the distinction here? Also, folks, you can read the article in full right now, but listen to the rest of the episode.
So this started to interest me as I was working on The Data Detective, because everybody I spoke to was like, oh, you're writing a book about statistics. That's great. I mean, it's not really a book about statistics. It's a book about how to think clearly, and statistics are a tool to help you. But as people thought I was writing this book about statistics, they kept saying, oh, that's great. You're going to tell people that they shouldn't believe all these fake statistics. And I was like, yeah, that is partly what I'm going to say. But if you just sit there disbelieving everything, you think it's all fake, then where do you end up? You end up in a very weird place. It feels kind of smart and kind of savvy to not believe what you're told here, or not believe the spin here, or to say, oh, that's just the kind of the mainstream media or whatever. It feels smart, but it can take you to some strange places. And when I looked at what was happening with, for example, the Capitol riots, the mainstream narrative about the people who invaded the Capitol was, these are people who believe all kinds of crazy stuff that's not true. Well, you could characterize them in that way, but I thought it was much more, it helped me much more understand is these are people who have decided to disbelieve all kinds of things. They've disbelieved what the New York Times is telling them. They disbelieve what CNN is telling them. They disbelieve what the judiciary are telling them. They disbelieve what, at the time, mainstream Republican politicians were telling them, although many of those politicians have changed their views. This is a group of people who don't trust anything. They don't believe any of these things. Now, then it then gets you to, well, and they believe some other stuff, but much more important to understand the disbelief, to understand the distrust, than to focus on what these people ended up believing.
Well, and what kind of power and influence does it take to sow that level of disbelief? To say, believe me, when I say to not believe this other, that I have differentiated from my word. What I'm saying is the truth, and what they're saying is not. And it creates this kind of us versus them mentality that if you let it go too far unchecked, it can erupt into violence in the streets. And it does go unchecked because that's sort of what it's designed to do, isn't it? It's like the weaponized rhetorical version of all of those clickbait articles that are designed to make you a little upset. This is designed to make you act out. This is sort of the culmination of all that other stuff, right?
And it goes back a long way. So the use of disbelief as a weapon goes back, well, at least to the cigarette industry. So I described this in The Data Detective. The evidence comes out, cigarettes are very dangerous, dramatically increase your risk of lung cancer, new evidence starts coming in, and heart disease and all kinds of other stuff. That's what the science is starting to show, but it's early days because we don't have great evidence, but that's what it's looking like. What's the response of the cigarette companies? Well, they could say, don't believe this stuff, it's untrue, trust us, we are giving you safe products, have we ever let you down? They realize that's not going to work. Instead, they just work on doubt. Well, yeah, isn't it interesting? These scientists, they haven't quite got their story all lined up, have they? They disagree about some interesting stuff. Like, these people are saying this thing, these people are saying this other thing. Shouldn't we do some more research? Shouldn't we dig a bit deeper? Shouldn't we wait until the full facts are out? And of course, all those things, they sound really reasonable. And in fact, they kind of are really reasonable, except you take them to the extreme conclusion, and the extreme conclusion is no one knows anything about anything and therefore keep smoking. And and it's incredibly effective. And it's been so interesting to see that strategy weaponized and continued in the modern world. And so many different people trying to sell so many different ideas, political ideologies, whatever, they'll focus first on doubt. Can you believe what you're being told? Can you believe what the mainstream media are telling you? And it's effective partly because, well, sometimes you shouldn't believe what you're told. Sometimes you shouldn't believe the mainstream media. But if you overdo it, it gets you to a very sort of corrosive place.
But also, the nature of research is, disagreement. The nature of research is this scientist says this scientist says this. It takes years sometimes to prove out, which parts are actually the truth. And it's the same with the media. And now we're in this super cluttered space that's very confusing and difficult. It's easier to just disbelieve than it is to pick out the right pieces over time yourself, I think.
The motto of the Royal Society, one of the oldest scientific societies in the world, is nullius in verba. Take nobody's word for it. You need to prove it to your own satisfaction. And that is, of course, how science works. But you can't go through the world just basically saying, I'm not going to believe anything anybody tells me about anything at all until I personally can verify it. You can't function like that. It works for a scientist in the science that they're investigating. It can't be a universal strategy for life. You have to pick your battles. What am I going to focus more curiosity on? What am I going to pay more attention to? And when am I just going to pick somebody that I will believe?
And that is so beautifully put. I think this is an exploration that has to be a continuing journey for people, especially when you're not a scientist and when you live in an age of endless inundation, right? Of information that grabs your attention and tells you, again, to get angry or to have an emotional reaction. It's quite a successful strategy, as you've established, both in the Data Detective and in other work. But before we move on from the world of conspiracy, Tim, I have to ask you, and I know this is a little bit of a silly question, do you have a favorite conspiracy theory? By which I mean not one you necessarily believe, but one that just is fascinating to you.
Well, here's one. I'm not even sure you'll have heard of this conspiracy theory, although I know you guys have heard a lot.
Rendlesham Forest? No. Okay, go ahead.
So, do you remember the reported sex attacks in Cologne in, I think, New Year's Eve, 2015, beginning of 2016? There were a lot of media reports that men of North African heritage were roaming around the center of Cologne and just attacking women, sexually assaulting women. And this got a lot of attention. People are horrified. Obviously, people are horrified. There's this weird, for people who are kind of liberal, there was this weird kind of tug of war, because you want to take sexual assault on women extremely seriously, but also you're very suspicious of reports of people with brown skin doing bad things. That feels like it's not politically correct. So people didn't know what to believe. There was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of angst. It was a very weird story. And then it just kind of, everyone seemed to forget about it. I never really saw any follow-up reporting. So that's the story. The conspiracy theory is that was, in some respects, Russian disinformation. I have no evidence that was Russian disinformation, other than one person who has had some experience of Russian disinformation once talked to me and wondered about that, because it was so strange. It came from nowhere. It was very sensitive in its timing. It was before the Brexit referendum in the UK, and I believe before an important election in Germany. It was, got all this attention. It just seemed odd. Like, what? Does that happen? That seems strange. And it never seems to have happened ever before. Never seems to have happened ever again. So then the conspiracy theory is that somehow the Kremlin paid some young men to do some stuff. I mean, I'm not saying that this didn't happen, but this was in some way organized. Now, that is a conspiracy theory that I find fascinating.
Why the Kremlin and not the right-wing government, like of Britain? Seems more like it would be a way of pushing the England for the English kind of narrative. Like why would the Kremlin have been involved? Like, how does that figure
so?
in?
I mean, Cologne is in Germany, so for a British faction to get involved you would have thought they'd arrange for it to happen in I don't know, Luton instead, some British city rather than a German city. Also, I just have more belief in the Kremlin's ability to organize this kind of thing than I do in any British politician's ability. I mean, let me just to be serious. I don't believe this conspiracy theory, and yet I'm not the kind of person who normally does believe in conspiracy theories. I tend to just go, oh, that's a really kind of compelling story, but surely not. But this is one that I can't get out of my head. But I've seen no evidence, and so I think I have to say that the most plausible explanation probably is that the kind of horrible thing that was reported just happened, and it was fairly spontaneous. And thank goodness it doesn't usually happen.
Okay, let's take a quick pause and hear a word from one of our sponsors, and then we'll be back with more from Tim. And we're back.
Tim, I want to just take some of the same logic that you have going on there and apply it to something that we've all been dealing with for, it's going to be 3 years now. It's over 3 years. The public reaction to a mandated vaccination. We get a ton of emails and voicemails and listeners calling in and giving us their opinions and how they feel and why they will or won't get vaccinated and their fears or their complete lack of fear when it comes to a pandemic. What have you seen, or how have you maybe analyzed the public reaction to a mandated vaccination?
Ooh, especially in your podcast, How to Vaccinate the World.
How to Vaccinate the World, which I did for the BBC, and we did that weekly for several months, starting with the announcement of the Pfizer trial results. So when it first became clear that there might well be a vaccine approved, and it looked pretty good, but it was all very early days. So who would take this, and how would it work, and how safe would it be, and how would it be manufactured, and how quickly could we get this into people's arms, and etc. So all of those issues we discussed, and it was such a privilege. I just met so many people who really thought so deeply about the subject. So mandated vaccination, I find it interesting that that's the way that you introduce the topic, because in the UK, the vaccine isn't mandatory. And I've crossed borders a few times recently, flown to various other European countries, and mostly it's easier to cross the border if you can show proof of vaccination, but it's not mandatory. You have to show negative tests and so on, which is kind of just more of a hassle. It's super easy to show that you've been vaccinated.
You're absolutely right, Tim. I'm sorry for even putting it that way. I think that's perhaps the perception that is out there, that exists, and the way it's spoken about, especially in, on places like Reddit and in places where maybe fears about the vaccine are discussed.
Yeah. So it is interesting. And, there is a school of thought that says, oh no, you should, it's a public health issue. It's like drink driving. You're not allowed to wander around unvaccinated, just like you're not allowed to get in your car if you've been drinking. I mean, there's an argument, but it doesn't seem just purely, who cares what I think, but it doesn't seem necessary, right? The vaccine seems very effective at protecting you from harm. It doesn't seem as effective as we hoped at preventing transmission. And therefore, there's a strong case that it's an individual decision. There's always got to be a presumption of an individual decision anyway. You would always want really good evidence before you mandated anything at all about anything. But, the vaccine protects you. It probably doesn't protect other people as much as we hoped. So it's not like the smallpox vaccine. Whereas the smallpox vaccine, you're like, hey, we actually could eradicate this disease forever. We just need to make sure that everybody who is anywhere close to being exposed to smallpox has the vaccine. Then you might say, well, maybe there's a reason to mandate. But for COVID, it's something that people have talked about a lot. But even in China, where they have a problem because they don't have enough, their elderly population is not very well vaccinated. Everyone who's young who is probably not at serious risk from COVID, unless they're very unlucky. They're all vaccinated. The elderly people are not vaccinated. You would have thought the Chinese government would get around to mandating it, but even the Chinese, unless I've missed something, have not mandated it. So, so what interests me more is this question of, well, first of all, what evidence can we gather? How safe is the vaccine? How effective is the vaccine? And then how do we have conversations about it? Talking to people who think about this a lot, the first thing to recognize is people are hesitant about having the vaccine for lots and lots of different reasons. So for some people, it's a religious objection. For some people, it's just there's fear of needles, like they want it, but they're really scared of the needle. Some people think that it's a pharmaceutical conspiracy, the vaccine is not safe. Some people just want to wait for more data. People just have different kinds of objection. And so to lump everybody together as anti-vaxxers or vaccine hesitant or whatever, these labels never really help. And if you have a loved one and you would like them to get vaccinated, then the conversation you need to have with them has got to involve a lot of listening to what are their reasons for. I mean, this is not just true of vaccination. This is true of anybody you disagree with. If you disagree with someone, ask a couple of questions and then shut up and just let them explain themselves to you.
But shouldn't it be a simpler conversation, kind of like how you're describing it, very matter-of-factly, and yet it's not? Do you think that's because of how it's been used as a talking point and kind of politicized to the point of weaponization to create this discord in the same ways that we've kind of been talking about throughout the episode?
Yeah, that doesn't help. There's a really interesting essay by Dan Kahan, who's a psychologist and law professor at Yale, and he studies two different vaccines. This is all pre-COVID, so it's kind of interesting. It's like a time capsule. He studied the HBV and HPV vaccines. So HBV is hepatitis B, HPV is human papillomavirus. So this is prevents the virus that can lead to cervical cancer. And what he found was these are two vaccines that are basically, they even kind of sound the same, where HBV, you get it, if your doctor says you should have the Hep B vaccine, you get the Hep B vaccine. You just take a cue from your physician. Whereas the HPV vaccine, you take a cue from your congressman. It's a completely political thing. And it's partly because it's associated with teenage sexuality. The virus is sexually transmitted. You're giving this vaccine to teenagers. It's kind of a sensitive topic. What does that imply about teenagers? Well, I mean, all it really implies is that one day, most teenagers will have sex one day. So you might as well vaccinate them before they start. But it's sensitive. And the companies that were making it were trying to get it made mandatory, which probably backfired. Well, definitely backfired. But Dan Kahan's point is, these are two vaccines, fundamentally in terms of public health, it's basically the same choice. But one of them is politicized and one of them is not. One of them, you just talk to your doctor and you take professional advice. One of them, you get your cues from whether you vote red or vote blue.
And this is going back to, I think, your earlier 3-step process for statistics. We can apply this to so many other things, right? Calm, context, curiosity. I'm repeating. And Matt, I like that you added the 4th C is cautionary tales. So one of my questions then at that point becomes a question about historical context and the dangers of broad brushes. I greatly appreciate how you pointed out the danger of putting everyone in one demographic bucket, right? The thought-terminating cliche of anti-vaxxers. It's quicker to say it on the evening news when you got 6 minutes, right? But with the idea of historical context, one of the things that we've heard often from people in the U.S. and abroad regarding their hesitancy to engage in a vaccine program, it's often a matter of historical context. They'll say, well, look at the Tuskegee experiments, right, here in the U.S. or in Pakistan. People will talk about U.S. intelligence services using a vaccination program as cover to hunt down Osama bin Laden. How much weight should people give those historical context arguments? And is there any sand to those arguments?
Well, I mean, both those things happened, and you've got to recognize them. And if I was talking to somebody who was using that as a concern, or that seemed to be a concern, I would just be curious to ask them, do you think a similar thing is happening with the COVID vaccine? Or just tell me more. Just tell me more about the connection between the two, because the connection to me is not obvious, but it might be obvious to them. Same with Tuskegee. I mean, the Tuskegee experiments. I mean, I wouldn't even dignify them with the term experiments. I mean, it's just horrendous what happened to allow African American men to just develop syphilis just so we could see what happened. I mean, it's astonishing.
It's like a war crime. I mean, it's akin to what the Nazis did, essentially.
It really, it's a war crime, except there was no war. I mean,
right.
It's awful, awful, awful. But I would be curious if someone brought that up to ask, well, tell me about the connection. Tell me how you see those two things playing out. I personally don't see the connection really, but people might be able to explain to me the connection, and then I'd be smarter, right? Because then they're explaining something to me that I don't know. Or maybe this sometimes happens, as people talk it through, they might go, actually now you ask me to elaborate, maybe the connection is not so strong. But I wouldn't be wanting to use that as a tactic. I think it's got to be genuine. You've got to ask the question, not hoping, then they'll talk themselves out of it.
Have you really seen people do that? I mean, you are giving people a lot of credit, I have to say. Like, I find so many people dig in deeper the more they talk it through, in my experience. Yeah,
of course. There's no magic bullet. It can happen. So by the way, I don't know if you guys have spoken to David McCraney, the host of the You Are Not So Smart podcast, but he has a new book coming very soon that really explores this kind of thing and various field experiments and trials where you just have a conversation and you ask people to explain themselves, because in the end, nobody gets persuaded by anybody else of anything. People persuade themselves. And if you're hoping someone might change their mind, you've got to give them room to think. And maybe as they're thinking, maybe as they're talking, maybe as they're explaining, it's just possible they'll change their mind. But you're right, Noel, you can't expect that. You can't kind of like, all I need to do is ask the question and boom, they will have this conversion. That's not how it works.
That's why it's called the Socratic method and not the Socratic solution, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we know what they did to Socrates.
For the whole vaccine thing, I really do blame British television, Tim. I want you to know that. And specifically Dennis Kelly and the show Utopia that came out, and I think it was early 2000s or mid 2000s. And I blame you completely, Utopia, for making everybody go, "Oh, vaccines are bad."
But it is amazing when you have these conversations what people will tell you. I was really struck by. I had a conversation with an imam. This is for part of How to Vaccinate the World, and so he a lot of his congregants, young Islamic men, go to his mosque, and he said some of them had this belief that the vaccine wasn't halal, so it was religiously forbidden because it contained animal products, which it turns out isn't true. But that's a conversation that they could have. And others felt that it was to take a vaccine was to break your fast. So they had the festival of Ramadan. You're not allowed to eat or drink during the daylight hours. You could, for logistical reasons, you could only get vaccinated during the daylight hours, and they felt that was breaking their fast. So he would talk to them, and he would explain that in his opinion as a religious authority, it was okay to be vaccinated. It's okay to receive it's a medical treatment, and medical treatment is different from eating and drinking. But just like, it never occurred to me that this might be a reason someone would object. And then he said something that really stuck with me. He said, I tell them that the vaccine is a gift from God. God is working through the scientists who made this vaccine, and the vaccine is a gift from God. And I'm not a religious man. It brought tears to my eyes. It was just to have somebody who has a totally different worldview to me, thinking about what's been done and what's been achieved, and expressing it in a way that would never have occurred to me. And yeah, you only learn this stuff if you ask the question.
But I understand that's a very distinct point that's being made to a distinct group by someone with a basis in faith. And then it's also like even a very fascinating and moving cosign to say this is a way of having people, buy into this, whether it's complete. I mean, I know it seems genuine. To me, it truly seems like it's coming from a place of genuineness. But where does the microchipping stuff come from? Where does the 5G stuff come from? Is someone just inventing this out of whole cloth in isolation and then spreading it a little at a time and it gets picked up like a meme? Like, where's that coming from?
So, yeah, I'm not an expert in that, but I did ask an expert, and I said, well, is it, do people genuinely believe this? Or is it disinformation, Chinese disinformation, Russian disinformation? Or is it people trying to sell something, like they're trying to sell vitamins or whatever, some alternative cure? And she said, well, it's all three. As far as she can work out, there are different sources. There's loads and loads of different sources of disinformation. Some of it sticks, some of it doesn't. It's invented for different reasons. It gets spread for different reasons, and I mean that's true of information as well. I mean, Noel, I loved the way you put it when you said it's a very specific point in a very specific context. But that's true of almost everything. Everyone believes. It's coming from a very specific context. And the fact that we put each other in buckets, like, oh, they're red staters, they're blue staters, they're anti-vaxxers, they're woke. You put people in buckets, you slap the label on them, and that's when you stop engaging with them as human beings and you stop trying to understand the individual context. And to be honest, we don't just do this to each other, we do it to ourselves as well. In certain contexts, we adopt these mentalities and we're like, well, I say the things I'm supposed to say and I believe the things I'm supposed to believe and I perform membership of this tribe. None of us are at our best in those circumstances.
It reminds me of the expression, and I'm sure annoys you, the idea of don't let yourself become a statistic. You know what I mean? Like, don't be someone that gets killed in a certain situation because you do something stupid, but that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about whittling someone down to like the most basic, easy to understand element. But that's not what statistics are at all. They're much more complex. But I don't know, it's just an interesting kind of cognitively dissonant concept, the idea of becoming a statistic.
Yeah, and it's true though, and this is something I'd say in the Data Detective, that there are just certain things that are easier to measure. And the easiest thing of all to measure is, did somebody die or not? I mean, there's still some wiggle room.
Sorry,
you'd be surprised. But generally, that's the thing. When you're measuring mental health, or you're measuring injuries, like, is it a serious injury? Is it a minor injury? Is it not really an injury at all? Does it get counted? Deaths get counted. And so there are certain things that they end up absorbing our attention, not just because death is obviously we should pay attention to death, but also they absorb our attention because you can count it. And so something like, say, long COVID, side effects of a COVID infection or side effects of vaccination is much harder to measure. Someone dies, you can measure that. So that's an inbuilt bias in statistics, and it's always worth. I would never dismiss statistics for that reason, but you need to be aware.
And I would also add, death is the great commonality, right? So that's something everyone can identify with, unfortunately, at some point. This has been such a fascinating conversation, Tim. My only regret here is that we can't make this a whole series of episodes just yet. But if you would like to learn more, just as Matt, Noel, and I have, about Cautionary Tales, do check out the show, available wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Take a page from Matt's book and join me being as a fan of the Data Detective, along with The Undercover Economist and Messy, and How to Make the World Add Up. Tim Harford, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can people learn more about your work, both in and outside of the things we've discussed?
My website is timharford.com. That's not Hartford, Connecticut. There's no T in it. timharford.com. And there you've got my articles for the Financial Times. You've got links to the podcast, links to the books. That's the best place, I think, to find out more.
And I would just recommend everyone listen to a specific episode of Cautionary Tales that we kind of mentioned here. It's a beautiful story of Howard Carter, a cheeky wound, some spooky electric, and an empathetic hound. It's beautiful. It's about the mummy's curse.
And in the meantime, if you want to get in touch with us, you can find us all over the internet. We are on the Facebook, the Twitter, all of those, the YouTube under the handle Conspiracy Stuff. On Instagram, we're Conspiracy Stuff Show. If you don't want to go onto the social media, you can also give us a telephone call. We have our very own hotline with an associated voicemail.
Sure, call 1-833-STDWYTK. When you call in, give yourself a cool nickname, whatever you want it to be, that's great. You've got 3 minutes, say whatever you'd like. Please include whether or not we can use your name and voice in the show. Thanks so much. If you don't want to call with your voice, you can instead send us a good old-fashioned email. We are
conspiracy@iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.